So thank you guys all for coming to my virtual PhD defense. I'm going to go over some of the projects that I've been working on for the last 5 years, almost, as Tom said. So first, I would like to thank my collaborators, my research assistants, my committee members, and all of my funding sources. Without these people and their support, this research would have been highly improbable. So I'm very grateful for you all, and thank you. I want to talk a little bit about my personal background before we dive into my PhD research. And when I was about 16 years old, my parents took us to see, me and my brother, to see An Inconvenient Truth in theaters. It was a very Berkeley weekend activity. And this film was really eye-opening to me because not only did it show me that there was a huge power in media, but also that global climate change was going to be one of the biggest threats that my generation faced. At the same time, I was taking a global climate change course as a senior in high school. And this really sparked a passion for me to work on conservation projects that had to do with anthropogenic change and in particular climate change. And I've dedicated the last 14 years of my effects have on species. So first I want to talk about the Anthropocene, which is currently the epoch we're living in. And this is viewed as the period during which human activity has been the dominant influence on climate and the environment. And the Anthropocene is characterized by soaring greenhouse gas emission rates, extreme weather events, and irreversible damage to our natural environments. Since the Industrial Revolution, we've seen global carbon dioxide atmospheric concentration rates just soar exponentially without any end in sight. And this has led to a warming of global temperatures by upward of 1 degree Celsius, particularly at the poles, but also it affects temperate and tropical zones. The tropics are the most biodiverse regions in the world, and they're impacted by a number of anthropogenic pressures, which range from habitat loss, disease, illicit activities and resource extraction, as well as climate change. Globally, it's interesting because there's only 29% of land surface that is, or of Earth's surface that is land, and 50% of this is used for agriculture. And this type of human pressure really leads to the degradation and loss of critical habitat for many wild animals. Agricultural expansion as well as intensification is especially pervasive in the tropics, where high levels of biodiversity are found. So when we're losing or converting forests to agriculture, it's really reducing the landscape's ability to mitigate climate impacts, as well as decreasing connectivity across the landscape, which is really detrimental to wild species. So both land use change and climate change impact species extinction rates. And the compounding effect of the two can really expedite these extinction rates. And both of these anthropogenic threats impact the tropics especially, and the species that dwell there, including high numbers of amphibian species. Globally, amphibian species richness is the highest in the tropics as well. You can see on this picture that the dark blue areas have really high numbers of species, and we see our eyes are immediately drawn to South America, which harbors not only the Amazon, but also the Andean chain, where there's high levels of biodiversity and endemism. Now, globally, amphibians are the most threatened vertebrate species, with upwards of 30% of all amphibians threatened with extinction. And declines in amphibians have been the most prevalent amongst neotropical stream-associated species, which is largely due to a fungus called chytrid, which has wiped out numbers of populations and led to species extinctions, including the Panamanian golden frog, which is pictured on this slide. While chytrid wasn't a huge problem at my research site, there's also many other issues like habitat loss, pollution, contamination that lead to extinction and increased threats on amphibian species. Now, the most threatened amphibian species are pictured here in these boxes, and I'm going to focus on the lower left-hand corner box, the Mesoamerica, Caribbean, and Andes. So we are going to travel down to Colombia, and not Costa Rica, Tom, Colombia. And this is a mega diverse country. It actually has the second highest number of amphibian species in the world. And Colombia is really unique because it's surrounded by two oceans, the Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean, as well as 3 Andean mountain ranges, and also the isolated Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, And this type of geographical setting has given way to really high levels of biodiversity and endemism, particularly in montane regions and particularly with amphibian species. Colombia also has a really large agricultural industry, and it's the third largest global coffee exporter. And 90% of coffee here is shade grown and on small shareholder farms. So that means that most farmers have less than 5 hectares of land. And it's a very laborious process. Coffee is handpicked by farmers during cosecha or harvest, and it's really kind of backbreaking work. So traditionally, shade coffee, which is pictured here on the left, is preferred habitat over sun coffee on the right for biodiversity because it's a more structurally diverse habitat and it can increase connectivity across the landscape. So what we know about Colombia is that it's a mega diverse country. It's the second highest country in amphibian diversity, and it's also this really important region for coffee. But Colombia really struggles with violence, corruption, and deforestation. And so in 2016, the former president, Juan Manuel Santos, signed a historic peace deal ending kind of a 50+ year civil war in Colombia. And so there was a lot of excitement about the opportunities that would arise from this peace deal. But since the presidential change, 2017 to 2019 were actually some of the largest years of deforestation in Colombia. You can see here a picture on the right in the Amazon. Deforestation occurs in the yellow and red zones. And so the peace deal has actually really kind of fallen badly with the new administration. And Colombia is actually the most deadly country on earth for environmental activists. And so many social and environmental leaders are being killed every year. And they're with COVID now, it's still continuing. So this is a big problem for Colombia. So we have this country that's, mega diverse, high in amphibian diversity, and a really important agricultural sector, but it also has high levels of deforestation in regions. There's increasing agricultural intensity, and there's also this failing peace agreement, which has led to an increase in violence. So Colombia has these kind of two sides to it. Now, when I started in 2017, when I moved down there on my Fulbright fellowship, I was pretty excited because our cohort was the first cohort to go to Colombia in this new era of peace and research opportunities. And so my main interest was understanding these anthropogenic impacts, particularly land use change and climate change, and how it impacted amphibians in my study region. So I traveled to the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta in the Circle. It's a isolated mountain range on the Caribbean coast, and it rises from the sea to 5,775 meters, so just under 20,000 feet in less than 42 kilometers. So there's extreme changes in topography, which creates a lot of zonation, and the region also contains some of the majority of Colombia's ecosystems. So you can find coral reefs, dry forest, cloud forest, Paramo habitat, which is a high elevation natural grassland habitat, and the snowy peaks as well, pictured here on the bottom. It was also ranked in 2013 the world's most irreplaceable site for threatened species. So globally, it's a really important region for conservation. But the Sierra Nevada isn't just home to immense biological diversity. Also, it's home to a lot of cultural diversity, including 4 indigenous groups and a large campesino or a rural farmer population that mostly subsists by growing coffee. So I'm going to dive into my research questions. I had 3 main questions that I wanted to answer that I thought would help provide more knowledge about amphibians in this understudied region, as well as the conservation actions we might be able to take. So the first question related to what environmental variables drive amphibian distribution and community composition in the Sierra Nevada? And the second question, after I figured out, where the amphibians were distributed and everything, I wanted to know more species specific, what was the vulnerability of amphibians to climate change? So to answer these first 2 questions, I conducted 3 visual encounter surveys for amphibians at night from September 2017 to July 2018 across 36 sites. So this means we walked around in the jungle at night looking for frogs and 1 salamander species. And I did surveys across 3 different elevational bands. So I had a low band, which was from 800 to 1200 meters, a middle band, which was 1,200 to 2,000 meters, and a high band, which was 2,000 to 3,600 meters. So I tried to make sure that at least one transect per land cover type had a water, whether it was a stream or a waterfall. And we surveyed across 5 land cover types, but I'm going to go over those land cover types in a couple slides. I also collected data on macro, micro environmental variables that I thought may influence amphibian distributions. So things like canopy cover, elevation, land cover type, leaf litter cover, and depth, and grassy and woody understory. So for these first 2 questions, I used the visual encounter survey data as well as environmental data, which was collected in the field. And then the second question on climate change also used amphibian occurrence data records from GBIF, which is a global database for species distribution records. So as a nod to my ABS training, we know that conservation doesn't exist in a vacuum. So in order to create these effective conservation plans for species, we have to not only gather sound scientific data on the threats and challenges that the species face, but also the conservation opportunities within the region. And so this includes working with local communities and land users. And so my third question was related to users. So I wanted to know what local land users' perceptions, and in this case, it was coffee farmers, on conservation issues. So things like biodiversity and climate change. And so kind of understanding how we could work with those coffee farmers in the future. I conducted 5 focus groups across 5 coffee farming communities. I pre-prepared questions that were related to biodiversity, wildlife, climate change, sustainability, and livelihoods. And then I grouped responses into themes that would hopefully assist in future conservation efforts in the region. So we're gonna jump into chapter 1, which was, again, understanding what environmental variables drive amphibian distribution and community composition in the Sierra Nevada. So I worked with 19 species, 18 frogs and 1 salamander, across the elevational range from 800 to 3,600 meters. I actually published this chapter in February of this year, so basically the equivalent of 9 years ago. And it really examined or found out that land cover was driving amphibian diversity across these steep elevational gradients. And so I'm going to walk you guys through some of our results. So first, this is a map of my study region. On the left-hand side in the left box, or the orange box, is where all 36 sites were found. The orange highlighted areas are protected areas. So in the Sierra Nevada, there over 2,500 meters is a national park. It's not necessarily there's no enforcement within the national park per se. It's also indigenous territory, so it's managed by indigenous groups as well as national parks. Elevation ranges go from light gray to dark gray indicating higher elevation. On the right-hand side, I have all 36 sites denoted by color scheme relating to land cover type. So the teal is forest, orange is coffee, purple is ecotone, hot pink is paramo, and green is pasture. And again, the 3 different elevational bands are here in light gray to dark gray, light gray indicating low, and the darkest gray is the high sites. So I surveyed in these 5 land cover types, forest, paramo, which is that high elevation grassland habitat, ecotone, shade coffee, and agricultural pasture. I didn't include a picture because that is just like a kind of typical grassy pasture. Ecotone I defined as transitional degraded habitat that occurs near edges between 2 or more types of contiguous land cover. So between forest and agriculture, agricultural and pasture. Here, ecotone is pictured kind of on, if you guys can see, there's a road that slices this picture, and above the road is actually coffee, as well as some plantains, I believe, being grown. And then right below, where it's more forested, there's actually a riparian element that runs through a coffee farm. And it's surrounded by forest type of features, so big trees and everything. And so this is kind of what we consider ecotone in the region. So I surveyed 19 species again, and 16 were endemic, indicating that this is a high endemism region. It was 16 endemics across 7 genera. So our first finding was about mean species richness at sites. So on the y-axis, we have mean species richness, and on the x-axis, we have natural land covers and anthropogenic land covers. And we found that species richness was highest in high forest, medium forest, as well as the ecotones. We weren't really finding a lot of species in coffee or pasture, low forest either, because the low forest was often very dry and degraded, and also was outside of the elevational range for many of our species. For mean species abundance here on the y-axis, we also found similar results. So we found that in high and medium forest and in the ecotones, we were finding higher species abundance than in the other anthropogenic land covers like coffee and pasture. And then the Paramo only has two species that exist at that range. So we found that both species richness and abundance were highest in forest and ecotone, but they were actually very low in shade coffee in the Sierra Nevada, which was not a similar finding to other previous shade coffee studies. We found that amphibians were really grouping, they were clustering across the landscape by land cover. So starting from the left of this graph, we have all the species, and we see that there's specific groups. So Karakari is found from high Paramo and forest, Paramo and ecotone. And then we move to the right and we see that there's a low and medium band of species that occupy ecotone habitats. There's this big band in the middle that's a forest, medium and high forest dwelling species. And then on the right-hand side in the purple box, we have species that are occurring at higher elevations in anthropogenic land cover types like pasture. So again, we saw that species were really clustering by and associating closely with land cover types. These top two species, Cryptobatrachus boulangeri and Colostatus ruthveni, here in the circle with the triangles, which indicates ecotone. Another circle with diamonds in it, and that represents forested habitat. And these two Pristimantes species, Sancta Marte and Megalopes, were closely associated with forest. So we found these distinct clusters of communities across land cover types. So again, here was the question I was interested in. And our main findings were that land cover was driving community composition in the region, and that forest and ecotone had highest mean species richness and mean abundance, and that shade coffee in the area really is not suitable for amphibians. And this was, again, unlike studies that had been previously done in Mexico and Puerto Rico. So what we can pull from these results is that ecotone was really interesting to us, was that this represents a conservation opportunity. So ecotone can provide connectivity between these degraded landscapes and is an important transitional habitat. And maintaining ecotone can actually bolster conservation initiatives. So in the region, a lot of ecotone occurs in the form of riparian elements, that riparian forested elements that run through parts of agriculture. So this really was an opportunity to say, hey, we can, reforest these areas or work with farmers to make sure they maintain these areas that will increase connectivity in the landscape and boost amphibian habitats. So the second question I was interested in was about the vulnerability of amphibians to climate change. So now that I knew more about their distribution and land cover type, we wanted to know more about species-specific impacts of climate change. So in 2016, the IUCN Species Specialist Group for Climate Change came out with these guidelines for assessing species vulnerability. And as part of the group, my research is one of the pilot studies looking at vulnerability assessments for small ranging endemic species. Also, these guidelines just recently came out and are available in Spanish. You can find them online by Googling them, or you can email me later and I can send them to you. So that's pretty exciting. I want to go over some key terms when we talk about vulnerability. So vulnerability is measured by exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity to species. And exposure is things like extrinsic factors, so habitat loss within a range, the diseases, invasive species within the ranges as well. Sensitivity is measured by intrinsic factors, so genetic diversity or dispersal distance. And then adaptive capacity is the ability of species to cope or to adjust to that given change. So that could also include dispersal distances and physiological impacts. And so These are kind of used in a ranking system. They can be categorical variables or numerical. And the equation here for vulnerability is the sum of exposure and sensitivity on a species minus the adaptive capacity. So there's four main approaches that you can do a climate change vulnerability assessment, or a CCVA. They range from less detail to higher detail. So these are trait-based, correlative, and mechanistic. And trait-based is the least detailed. You can find trait information online about a lot of species or in previous studies. Correlative approaches are probably the most widely used because you can use occurrence data, which again, you can collect in the field or find online like GBIF. And then finally, mechanistic data, which is the most detailed and provides, you can actually say something about species extinction probability. And so this is a highly time-consuming and expensive way to collect data, and it's not often that we find species with mechanistic data. And so we were limited in our study by permitting issues as well as accessibility to the mountain range. And so, and like lab equipment, we didn't have a lab to work in or any of the equipment. So I chose to do a correlative and trait-based combined approach. So in my study, when I conducted the CCVA, we grouped variables into exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. So exposure were things like area of habitat, which is a species range, climate niche overlap, and protected area coverage. And then things for sensitivity, it was things like trait data, which we obtained online and in previous databases about foot webbing and development. So either if species were direct developers or non-direct developers. And both of these were indicators of water dependency in the region. And then adaptive capacity, looking at previous studies like land cover from the first chapter, as well as previous studies on physiology and epidemiology in the region. So first, I want to go over this first measure of exposure, which is area of habitat, which is defined as habitat available to a species that is habitat within its range. So we use data from the IUCN Red List, which is the most comprehensive data set that we have for the species in this region. And it's pictured here on the left-hand side. The IUCN draws polygons around species occurrences. They're called EOOs, the extent of occurrence. And so here on the left-hand side, we have the IUCN Red List range maps and the overlap of all our species here. And so from the dark blue is less overlap and the yellow is more overlap. And we see a lot of overlap in the ranges in the northwestern corner of the Sierra Nevada. And then on the right-hand side, what we did was we decided to filter these range maps on the IUCN by environmental variables. So we filtered them by elevation and land covered type as defined by the IUCN. And so this greatly reduced the ranges of many species, with the lowest reduction by 41% and the highest reduction of range by 97%. And so we see on the right-hand side that this is a more refined map, and there's less overlap in that northwestern corner, although that's where it primarily occurs. But now these ranges are more specific and more representative of tropical species who often have smaller niches and more specialized niches. So this is the AOH map. It's actually really helpful in conservation initiatives because it's much more defined, and we can actually use this to understand the potential habitat use and requirements for species. So in order to gather information on climatic niche overlap, we used data from the visual encounter surveys and GBIF for 16 species that had greater than 5 locations. We used occurrence data, and we used 17 general circulation models and 19 bioclimatic variables from WorldClim. So these variables related mostly to temperature and precipitation. And we looked at 2 different emission scenarios. So we looked at a RCP 4.5 scenario, which is a low emission scenario. And we looked at both of these for 2050, so 30 years from now. And then we looked at the RCP 8.5, which is a high emission scenario. So in a lot of cases, we're already surpassing the low emission scenario, but we wanted to give kind of a more moderate approach, like the best case scenario and one of the worst. So here are the results from the climatic niche overlap. And on the left-hand side, we have the current map from 2020. The dark blue again represents low species overlap of niche space, climatic niche space, and then yellow is high species overlap. So again, we're seeing the higher overlap in the northwestern corner. The white bands on the mountain represent increases of elevation by 1,500 meters. So that first band that goes all the way around the mountain is 1,500 meters, the second is 3,000, and the third is 4,000 meters. On the right-hand side, we have the two different RCP scenarios. So at the top, we have the 4.5, and at the bottom, we have the 8.5, so the low and high emission scenarios. And again, we see less species overlap in both of these scenarios. And on the right-hand side, we have a map of the 2050 predicted species change. So dark red means we're losing more species and more potentially climatically suitable space for these species. So it's kind of bad in both scenarios, but it's especially pronounced in the 8.5 scenario. So we're basically gonna see loss of suitable habitat for species. We're gonna see species overlap minimizing as some species potentially go extinct or are locally extirpated. So I want to show you guys the high threat species. So we did the CCVA for all 16 species that we had data for. And there were 7 species that ranked high on our climate change vulnerability assessment. So we have the AOH measurement, which is kilometers squared. We have CENV, which is the current environmental landscape or climatic niche overlap that we saw from the previous slide. And then we have ENV 4.5 and ENV 8.5, which is the percent remaining from that current environmental space, the CENV, in 2050. So for the first species, Atelopus kerikeri, we have a really low already, 11.78 out of 100. And then that's reduced by 32%. There's only 32% remaining in 2050 for 4.5 of that original space. And then there's only 31% remaining in the 8.5 scenario. We also looked at protected area coverage from the World Database of Protected Areas. The species are protected because they occur at high elevation ranges within the national park space and private reserves. And then we looked at land cover types too, and we also looked at the trait data, which I didn't include in this table. But yes, so we found that all 3 Atelopus species, which is the most threatened genus of amphibians in the world, were highly vulnerable to climate change because they are very water dependent. They occur in few locations. The Atelopus naume is only known from one breeding location in the region. Naume and Carmelite on here, the NAs, didn't have enough location data to run the climatic niche overlap for those species, so that's why they say NA. But while these species are protected by protected areas, you know, they just have such specialized niches, and they really are forest dwelling species. And in the case of kerikeri, a Paramo species, a high elevation species. We also saw that there was 4 pristimantes who were highly vulnerable to climate change. And pristimantes are more forest dwelling species, largely use leaf litter. And these species, while most of them are direct developers and they have less dependency on water, they have really low predicted climatic niche space like the Atelopus, and they also have minimal protected area coverage. And some of the ranges of these, they're really understudied, so there's not a lot known about pristimantes. So if anyone needs a project to do in this region, pristimantes would be a fantastic idea. So what we found from the vulnerability of amphibians to climate change was that we had 7 species that were highly vulnerable to climate change. And the majority of these species and the most impacted area of the Sierra Nevada would be the northwestern region. And that isolation and extremely restricted ranges increased vulnerability to climate change for all these species. And because it is a high endemism area, which means that these species are only found in this mountain range, they are particularly susceptible to climatic impacts. So for my final chapter, I wanted to understand the local land users, in this case coffee farmers, perceptions on conservation issues. So first, I want to show you guys this map because it is the map of coffee growing across the world. In the green areas, you can see where coffee is grown in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. And coffee is mostly exported to the US and EU. So there's actually like a very inequitable supply chain of coffee where the farmers see very little money. And the coffee prices that farmers receive are based off of a market price in New York in the US. And these prices have been falling for the last 10 years. And so it's getting increasingly difficult for coffee farmers to gain money from coffee growing, as well as they are also highly impacted by climate change issues. And there's been quite a few studies in the last few years highlighting this, especially in Latin America. So coffee in the Sierra Nevada, it's one of the oldest coffee growing regions in Colombia, and it has over 20,000 hectares of land devoted to growing coffee. 95% of this is shade coffee, and presumably 50% is organic, which means that they aren't using fertilizers or pesticides. And again, 95% of these farmers are small shareholders, so they have less than 5 hectares of coffee. And this is really their main livelihood and their main source of income. Just again, a reminder that this is all shade coffee, so it looks like the left-hand side, and we are not finding amphibians in shade coffee, and I hypothesize that this is largely due to management practices, which is critical for maintaining amphibian populations on agricultural landscapes. There's a lot of bird-friendly coffee, as well as coffee that's suitable for large mammalian species, but again, we're not seeing that with amphibians. So I conducted 5 focus groups in 2 coffee growing regions, Santa Marta and Cienega. Here on the left in the dark blue, that's Santa Marta, and the lighter blue is Cienega. And I worked with the Federación Nacional de Cafeteros, and they are a private organization that was formed in 1927 to look after the welfare of coffee farmers. And the Federación is really cool because they have a group of extension agents that go out into the communities and provide communities with technology, new disease-resistant plants, and kind of check in on everyone to see how they're doing. The FNC also has a scientific investigation branch called Seni Cafe, and they're in charge of, again, researching updated technology and also working to get climate-resistant plants and disease-resistant plants out to farmers. And the really important thing about FNC is that if you're a member of this organization as a coffee farmer, they provide a guarantee of purchase. So on years where coffee prices are extremely low, they still will buy coffee from coffee farmers. So it's kind of an extra security. And so I worked with them to conduct the focus groups. 4 of the 5 focus groups that I worked on actually had an extension member from FNC present. So here's 4 of the focus groups I worked with. They were all adults, mostly male participants, but also some female farmers. And some of the members consisted of family members, so brothers or cousins, etc. And these focus groups were held either in a common space, so someone's farm or terraza, or a local tienda, so like a store. And the surveys were conducted in Spanish with myself and an assistant. And we asked questions. We came with pre-prepared questions that were related to biodiversity, climate change, wildlife. So we asked things like, what is biodiversity? How are the farmers defining biodiversity? We wanted to know if they had animals on their farm and if they saw them, and if they saw any frogs in particular. We asked about observed changes in weather, climate patterns, if farmers had coffee certifications, and if so, what kinds, if farmers would be willing to engage in sustainable programs, their concerns about growing coffee and their future. We asked them about the Colombian government and the support for coffee farmers. And we also just gained background information on coffee farming in general, as well as land use. And finally, with these 4 groups pictured, I asked them to draw out their activities during a calendar year. So we made a coffee calendar of all the management activities that occurred throughout the year. Okay, so I conducted a qualitative content analysis that basically groups responses from participants into subcategories, generic categories, and then main themes. So I'm actually going to start in the middle here in the generic categories, which were natural resources, land use management, infrastructure, and socioeconomic constraints. And so for natural resources, the subcategories pertain to the definition of biodiversity, which people usually said were, the plants and animals on their farms, wildlife, them noting certain types of wildlife or different behaviors. Climate change, all the groups noted differences in precipitation levels, as well as behavioral shifts in some animals, some species, bird species that had moved up the mountain over the years, and then the value of their landscape. So we asked every group what they valued most about the landscape, and interestingly, every single group said they valued water. There was a couple groups who also specifically mentioned conservation, and doing conservation and taking care of their land was really important to them. Under land use management, we asked about certifications. About, I don't know, I'd say 60% of the people, of our participants, were certified with organic type of certifications, and the other 40 were not. We also conducted a coffee calendar, like I mentioned, which I'll show you on the next slide. And then waste management. So for infrastructure, we talked to them about waste management issues, limited network service, so bad cell reception. There's weeks, days that they will go without being able to contact anyone in the city in Santa Marta. And then bad roads. So these regions are all really remote, and you have to drive up mountain dirt and rock roads for hours in trucks, or take a moto taxi, a motorcycle up. And it's really difficult for farmers to get resources up and down the mountain, as well as move their coffee. A lot of them use mules to move coffee. And then the socioeconomic constraints. So every single group complained that the coffee prices were too low. They wanted to sell directly to buyers. They wanted higher prices. They really struggled making money from coffee. They also complained that there is no government assistance from federal government, and that their children went to university, which wasn't the complaint per se, but that they didn't want to come back to take care of the land or be a campesino, be a coffee farmer. And finally, they said that some local community members accepted bribes, as well as there was corruption in the local environmental authorities and government levels. So from these generic categories, I grouped these into two categories: conservation program design, which included the natural resources and land use management side, and then livelihood constraints, which were infrastructure and socioeconomic constraints. So normally in conservation, when people talk about designing a program for conservation, they focus on these two, land management and natural resources. And then people who do sustainable and economic development often focus on the livelihood constraints, so infrastructure, socioeconomic constraints. But the issue is we can't really address conservation and conservation problems if we are looking at just really need to integrate these two in order to develop comprehensive conservation plans for regions with local communities and scientists and other practitioners. So here's the coffee calendar, which highlighted main activities during the calendar year. So on the left-hand side, we have the number of communities that participate in specific activity, the y-axis, and on the x-axis, we have each month. And what we really found out from this calendar was that during the rainy season, which is the reproductive season for amphibians, when they're really moving across the landscape, as well as breeding in these streams near or adjacent to coffee farms, that's when farmers are ramping up their management activities. So they're putting out fertilizer, they're planting other crops, they're also clearing for coffee. So coffee farmers will clear, in the Sierra Nevada, will clear their understory with machetes often, and that really removes all the leaf litter and all the potential habitat that amphibians might use. And so we see this mismatch with coffee farming and amphibian life history strategies. So the main findings, again, were that coffee farmers have this inherent value of the landscape, including water. Economic security drives decision making. So coffee farmers, they said they would like to be sustainable, but they just don't have the money to buy new technology or improve their farms. And management may be in conflict with critical amphibian life history periods. So I'm going to go over a quick recap of all these chapters. Chapter 1, amphibians preferred forested habitats, and they're not found in shade coffee in this region, but we can use ecotone as a conservation opportunity. And ecotone, again, is often represented as a riparian element within the landscape. Chapter 2 showed us that climate change will impact all the endemic amphibians, with 7 species highly at risk of climatic impacts. And it's particularly going to impact the northwestern region where this study took place. And then chapter 3 showed that coffee farmers who valued water and conservation were kind of limited by their economic stability. And so they based management decisions largely on what they're capable of doing based on the money that they have. Additionally, coffee is, the management practices that are currently happening are not very sustainable. There's high water usage during the washing process of coffee. And then coffee wastewater, so the water that's coming off of the processing, is often dumped into soils and watersheds. So it's contaminating surrounding habitats and it's a highly acidic crop. Um, and another issue with coffee is that the supply chain is highly inequitable. So farmers are losing money growing coffee sometimes, and they also base their decisions about sustainable management on their finances, so they're often limited in this aspect. So an opportunity that I saw was that water really was this life source and also a conservation opportunity. Watersheds are a really important amphibian habitat, especially in these ecotone regions and as riparian elements. Water is also what the local communities valued most about their landscape. And finally, water scarcity and contamination in the region is already an issue. Um, the farmers talked about reduced water levels, and a lot of climate models also show altered precipitation levels. So what I thought was, why don't we work together to build sustainable practices based on this love for water that coffee farmers have? We can marry sustainable practices and livelihoods with amphibian conservation, all founded on this idea of keeping water sources clean and keeping them intact. So this past year, I developed and worked on a project called Filters for Frogs. Actually, we're still technically working on this project with collaborators from Arizona State University, UNAM in Mexico, ProCat, an NGO in Colombia, and also the Federación de Cafeteros. And we worked in a town called San Pedro, which is located in the Cienega region. And it's also dubbed the sanctuary for harlequin toads. So again, the Antilopus species that are highly at risk. And here on the right-hand side in this picture is a tank, which is this system, this sustainable practice system, which is supposed to basically clean the water that's coming off of the coffee, the wastewater. It goes through a 3-system tank, and it supposedly removes all the organic components, and then it's dumped into a man-made pool so it's not contaminating uh, natural land or going into a watershed. So what we were interested in um, was understanding what was actually the water quality from the coffee wastewater process, and were these tanks actually working to reduce contamination. We measured water quality at coffee farms as well as in adjacent streams during harvest, so October to February this past year and this year. We conducted amphibian surveys in watersheds that were within or adjacent to coffee plantations. And then in the future, we also are aiming to provide participating farmers with some updated technology or helping them get new tanks or restore their tank systems. A lot of farmers have these systems but aren't using them, or they have problems with them. And a long-term plan is to hopefully create and expand certification guidelines to include watersheds and amphibians in the region, and also provide money for farmers who are participating in these programs so that they can get a little bit more and hopefully improve their livelihoods. So it's really cool because these on-the-ground conservation actions, they can help mitigate climate impacts by restoring forests and watersheds. They can improve livelihoods by providing some more income, and they can also help safeguard biodiversity at a local level. And so it's really important to get on the ground and do these types of projects. But the big elephant in the room is that global greenhouse gas emissions continue to soar at unprecedented rates, and even current policies, so even under the Paris Climate Agreement, which the US has pulled out from officially, we aren't going to keep our temperatures rising from below 2 degrees Celsius, which is kind of what scientists have said we need to do in order to not see mass extinctions and a huge change of the world as we know it. So governments really need to invest in sciences and make new pledges and new policies that are aimed at climate mitigation and adaptation policy. It's critical that we have international cooperation and governmental leadership as well. And so I know in the US that seems impossible right now. I don't want to end on that note. It seems like a dire scenario, but there is a reason to be hopeful. And that's because for the first time in my lifetime, we have this global youth climate movement that's being led by young men and women, people of color and indigenous leaders. And this has given me hope for the future because we are finally seeing, a slow but steady change in people who are being elected to office, as well as more engagement from people about how to create a better society. And so the passion that drives these young people to help create change and help move society forward is often the same passion that drives conservation researchers. And so these two photos are a photo of 2017 Nikki on the left and 2010 Nikki on the right. And 2017 Nikki had just finished her first field trip to the Paramo. I'd only been in Colombia about 2 weeks. I was speaking basic Spanish. I had no idea what was going on. I didn't even bring like utensils to eat. And I was doing things that I said I never would do, which is work in the jungle at night. And then 2010 Nikki was actually my first trip to Colombia with Global Wildlife Conservation, where I was also searching for frogs in a different region of Colombia. And I remember being there and thinking, hey, maybe one day I'll come back here. And I kind of put that in my mind. And it's really cool to see that arc completing in a decade, that from my first trip to Colombia to now 2020, I have almost completed a PhD. And so, I have a lot of things I've learned from this life experience, but I want to leave you with my 2 cents. And especially for, current grad students or people, in big transitions like a lot of us right now, I think it's really important, first of all, to build a community, whether it's your lab mates or colleagues or your yoga studio or your dance crew. Having that supportive community around you is really what can uplift you in moments of darkness, and it's super important. It's also really important to network and stay connected during your career. I worked with GWC back in 2010, and I still stayed connected with them. A lot of them are some of my good friends. And I also been able and fortunate to work with IUCN, and just sending, a text message to someone, just sending an email, checking in, really has helped me keep these collaborations alive and keep my friendships alive. And so I really have benefited from that as well. So your PhD is not your entire life. Grad school shouldn't be your entire life. It's part of who you are, and it's so important to take care of your mental and emotional health. I think it's something a lot of us grad students struggle with, and something that's not prioritized in academia. And so I urge people to take a break when they need it, to step out of academia for a moment, for a day, for a week, whatever you need, and just recharge. Also, too difficult tasks are letting yourself be vulnerable and open up. The times in my life where I've been vulnerable have been some of the most rewarding times. And so, yeah, I just urge, have your gratitude journal like I do at night. And at the end of the day, have fun. This is supposed to be an exciting time where we have a lot of creativity and we can go out and build these projects and make our own schedules. So yeah, I had a lot of fun and a lot of not fun too. There's a lot of people I need to thank for this project. First, my Colombian crew, Daniela, who's been with me since 2016, her entire family, the Jimenezes, who have taken me in, Carmen and Maito, who let us have our chem lab in their living room, who fed us and housed us, Jeff and Jose Luis for helping me collect data, and again to Nico and Edgar for being amazing collaborators personally and professionally, and really having my back in a lot of scenarios. To the OG crew, all my gal pals and my family, I'm so thankful to have a huge group of strong and independent women who've really, shaped my life. And I'm really, really thankful for all of your support through these last few years. My Colombia crew, who has also seen me through a lot of ups and downs and kept it super real. I'm so thankful for you guys. I honestly couldn't have survived living in Santa Marta, as you know, without you. And so I just want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart for being there and for also being on this call today. And finally, I want to thank Tom. You're not just a mentor to me, you're my friend, you're a dad when I don't need another one. And you've been there for me so much, so personally and professionally as well. And I'm just like very, very grateful for you. So thank you for that. Thank you all for listening. I hope that went well. I minimized everything. And yeah, gracias siempre. And I will take the silent applause and let me know if you have any questions. I don't know what do I do now? Hold on. End show? Grab a drink. Okay, hold on. Oh wait, let me put the faces on.
Woo.
Hey, Nikki.
Yo.
Congratulations!
Good job, Nikki.
Go, Nikki! We're so proud of you.
Nikki, you're the best. You did a super job.
Well done. Come on. This is just getting out of control.
Take the praise. Take the praise.
So wonderful.
That's Donna and Mike.
Bravo, Nikki. It was fabulous.
Thank you. I don't know. Tom, should I pull my presentation up, or what's the word for this? I don't know where Tom is.
Tom? Come in, Tom.
Apparently only my family left.
Oops, I was muted also. I'm sorry. If anybody has, we certainly have time for questions if anybody has any questions. And so it's going to be a little awkward with 100+ people on the line, but just say your name and I'll recognize you and you can ask Nikki a question. We'll have about 10 minutes for questions.
I don't know. Do I keep sharing my screen?
I'll open with a question. This is Lee.
Oh, of course you will, Lee.
Yeah. Well, first off, congratulations. I mean, it was a really, really great presentation. You've done so much, and you know, I really appreciate all of your participation in the ABS program and leadership with us. And I kind of have more of a comment than a question. And my comment is that, and I'd like for you to tell me if I'm off base or not, but so even though it's a little bit of an unfortunate result, I was really glad to see your results that shade coffee, you know, is not really supporting high diversity of amphibians. I think that's a really important finding that's going to go a long ways. And I feel that way because I've kind of felt like the literature on coffee and biodiversity in a way has been in a little bit of denial about, you know, coffee being, you know, good for biodiversity. And I would just like to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think that agriculture is a really difficult thing because there's so much monoculture crops that, you know, really limit wildlife, that when we see a type of crop like shade coffee that has like trees in it, we're like, oh yeah, this is great. Birds are still coming here and using the landscape. But they're starting to finally do more research on the actual, you know, vegetative structure and diversity within shade coffee. So it's not just like counting species anymore, but they're actually trying to understand what's driving, you know, different bird species using coffee. But I think for amphibians, it's really, amphibians are they're so specialized in their habitat. And where I worked, the coffee is just cleared constantly. And so there's no undergrowth, there's no leaf litter. It's really dry. There's a ton of ants and bugs and snakes in there. But yeah, it's honestly not good habitat for amphibians. But the thing is, these riparian elements literally occur just between two patches of coffee. So you'll walk through a stream that is full of amphibians and they're, you know, 10 feet away from a coffee plant. So that was kind of where the opportunity with working with these, you know, degraded watersheds and ecotone systems came in. But I do think it is something that needs to be studied, and it's so taxonomically dependent on the species if they're going to be using shade coffee or not. It's very different for every group.
I have a question. Brett.
Hey, Brett.
Yeah.
Hi. Congratulations. That was an awesome talk. All the dogs were paying super close attention. So as as a coffee addict myself, what steps can I take to, you know, maybe get more money towards the farmers directly instead of to the New York Stock Exchange?
I would say just give me the money and I'll distribute it. No, I mean there are sustainable and coffees that you can buy that are already benefiting farmers. So actually, ProCat, who I work with, they have a Jaguar friendly certification in the region as well as in Costa Rica, and that money goes back to conservation efforts in the region as well as helping with the farmers with their land use. So you can seek out different certifications that are helpful for there's lots of noise, for coffee farmers. And so there's also certifications that are specific to the social aspect of coffee, and there's also the conservation biodiversity side. So you can kind of seek out what you want to support as well. So lots of like echo.
Hey, Wendy, I see you're online. Do you have a question?
Hi there.
Hi, Wendy.
Hi, Nikki. Lovely to be able to watch your clips from South Africa. I'm thrilled to be able to join. Congratulations. That was fantastic. Well presented and an amazing PhD.
Thank you.
I'm very interested to hear what you think this COVID-19 epidemic is likely to do to coffee markets and as a result to both the people and the biodiversity.
Yeah, so I actually asked the head of the Federación de Cafeteros in Santa Marta about that. And he gave me like he kind of like brushed it off and was like, oh yeah, everything's going as normal, because they had already finished harvest where I was. So I think they're still able to get the coffee down the mountain to be processed. But right now the mountain is, where I work, is closed off to anyone. So no one can come up and no one can go down. And that's to protect the campesino and the indigenous populations in the area. I think it'll be fine for now. What I worry about is how long it goes. They need workers to come up for harvest. And so if they can't get people to come up and harvest, that'll be really difficult on the coffee. I think biodiversity will be fine there for now. The amphibians will be fine. They have pretty healthy populations up there. I don't foresee all of a sudden immense deforestation happening with the farmers. But we just have to wait and see, right? I don't know when I'll be able to go back to Colombia and when I'll be able to go back and finish this part of the project. We were supposed to do a workshop with the coffee farmer.
Okay, thank you. That's very interesting.
And it's kind of a bummer. We're gonna give them certificates for finishing and everything. So yeah, we'll see.
Great, thanks.
Do you have any other questions for anybody? You can raise your hand if you'd like, or just shout your name out and join in.
Hi, Nikki. I have a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
This is wonderful. I'm really excited.
You're so curvy.
I'm a little nervous here because, you're my good friend and you did amazing. I have a particular question on the microclimate for frogs versus coffee plantations. Do you have any suggestion on the way they manage these coffee plantations to be less cleared, tillaged, or have some sort of a buffer that could minimize some of the microclimate impacts that are perceived within the plantation versus riparian? Maybe like a happy middle ground. What do you think?
Yeah, there's one farm that we worked on which actually maintains kind of some of the understory, and they actually were the only farm where we did find some frogs there. They were juveniles. Pristimantes species couldn't be identified because they were so tiny, but they had like a fern type of undergrowth, and so there was more moisture as well. When they clear all that vegetation, it also makes it a lot drier. So by just leaving, it's kind of up to the farmer, if they are capable and think it's okay to leave some sort of undergrowth, they could. I didn't really ask though. That would be a good question to ask. Would ask farmers like, why? Like, do you need to clear everything? What is the reason behind that? Or can you leave, some set sort of undergrowth that might help amphibians move through the landscape?
Right.
Yeah, but I'm not. I mean, it could be done maybe, but again, I don't know. People are very set in their ways sometimes. So.
Right. Maybe throw in some test, but
yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Do we have any other questions? Anybody have a question still?
What are you going to do the rest of the day?
Not talk to you, Lee. No, I have my private meeting, and then I don't know. We're having a social distance dinner with some neighbors. Fun times.
Any other questions from anybody?
Hi, Nikki. This is Cynthia. I have a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just curious, as a researcher in the tropics, how do you see your role in the future given, the COVID situation and the inability to do field work in the tropics? What do you see, like, how are we going to mitigate that?
I don't know, because it's kind of, again, like it's a wait and see thing. I think that some people will be able to get back to their field sites before others, especially local partners. So for me, keeping up those relationships with local partners to say, hey, are you guys going to the field? Can you help pass along this information from our project or whatever? Working with extension agents, because they're likely going to be able to still keep going and visiting communities. For myself, I don't know when I'll be able to go back and do that, but we do still have plans to continue working in the area. I've been really fortunate to work with some great on-the-ground people, and so right now I think I'm gonna just have to rely on the Colombian partnerships that I have, and I think that's kind of what a lot of people are gonna have to do who work in, aren't working in the country or aren't in the country where their work is right now. So.
Well, it's really nice. I mean, your presentation was great, so congratulations on that.
Thank you.
And it's obvious that you've formed really deep, lasting relationships, so I'm sure you'll be successful.
Yes, thank you, hopefully.
For sure. Thanks.
Do we have any other questions from anybody?
I have a question. Hi, Nikki.
Hey, Chris.
So I was interested to know about what challenges you face with the reliability of responses to your survey, considering all the pressures that farmers are under from government or from paramilitaries, or just maybe the idea that they are being scrutinized by scientists. Did you have any challenges? How did you mitigate them?
So during the focus groups, it was actually really simple. Daniela, who I worked with, her entire family's from one of the communities. They're from San Pedro, so that really helped because they all know her. They're familiar with her family. Her family was super helpful with creating relationships with farmers and everything too. And because I was working with the FNC, people have a pretty good working relationship with them, so that wasn't really an issue during the focus groups. Not that I felt people were fairly honest, and they would be open about, they even were open about how other researchers had come and never come back, and they were really disappointed in them and didn't really trust researchers at this point. But we did find it really hard during the Filters for Frogs project when we were looking for sites to survey. A lot of farmers were really wary of us. They were like, what are you doing exactly? You're taking water samples, why? And so we realized quickly that a lot of people didn't want us taking water samples because a lot of those organic farms in the region are not actually organic. They're using fertilizer and they're spraying illegally, but the enforcement's really low. And so they didn't want us coming onto the farm and taking those samples because then they were worried that we would find out and report what they were doing. So they were still nice, but it was kind of like an awkward situation. We also found out that there was this coffee mafia in the mountain where some people controlled the distribution of the farms, and some of the most are small shareholder farmers, but some of the people owned multiple farms and they had a lot more sway, and they would make everyone give them their coffee, sell to them, and then they would go and distribute the coffee and stuff like that. So it's a lot more complex than I originally thought, as most problems are. But again, Chris, I know you live in one of the more dangerous areas in Colombia on the coast, but we didn't really find the paramilitaries there aren't particularly an issue. So it was more like this coffee mafia and their reluctance to give us samples of water because they are not actually organic.
I think we have time for another question. One more question. Does anybody have a question? Okay, if not, well, just one other. I do want to thank everybody for showing up. It was at the peak. I think we were up to 107 people attending this. It was amazing. Yeah,
didn't-
I want to thank Wendy Foden. For people who don't know Wendy Foden is actually the chair of the IUCN Climate Change Specialist Group who wrote the document. And she's calling in from South Africa, which is probably some god-awful hour right now. So I really want to
thank you, Wendy.
Thank you, Wendy, for calling in. So if there are no further questions, I'd recommend we all unmute our microphones and give Nikki one more round of applause.
Good job, Nikki. Oh, so cute. I wish I could see all your faces in person.
Doctor.
Oh, your hair.
Hi, Cynthia.
Well
Hey,
done, girlfriends.
Fabulous, Nikki.
Another
hey,
Dr. Roach in the family.
Okay, I have a quick message for the committee. I'm going to shut the meeting down for the committee, and then we can log back on again. Let's say at 2:25. Give everybody a break to get some water or a snack or go to the restroom, and then we'll log back in at 2:25. All right, committee.
On the separate link, right, Tom?
Yeah, it'll be you have a separate link in your email. It's this meeting number 2 with the password. Okay.
Okay, thank you guys for coming. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Tom. You're fabulous.
Congratulations, Nikki.
Thanks.
Bye.
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 Cheers, Nikki.
Oh, yeah.
Starting early.
Woke up.
Ciao.
Bye.
Ciao, Nikki. Ciao, ciao.
Bye, guys.